The iron shackles bit into Wilhelmina Orton's wrists as she knelt in the dusty jail yard. Her white wedding dress stained brown with dirt and streaked with sweat under the merciless Idaho sun. The year was 1883, and Challis was a town that showed no mercy to liars, especially not to women who fabricated stories about prominent men. She had been kneeling there for 6 hours, and the August heat was making her vision swim with black spots that danced like vultures circling overhead. Wilhelmina had never meant for things to spiral so far out of control. 3 weeks ago, she had been desperate and alone, her father freshly buried after a mining accident that left her penniless and homeless. When Theodore Marsh, the wealthy banker's son, had cornered her in the mercantile and made his intentions clear, she had panicked. His hands had been on her waist, his breath hot against her neck, and she had shoved him away with all her strength. He had stumbled backward into a display of canned goods, creating a tremendous crash that brought half the town running. In that moment of panic, with everyone staring at her and Theodore's face twisted in rage, she had done the unthinkable. She had claimed they were engaged. She had claimed he had proposed months ago, that they had been secretly courting, that today was meant to be their wedding day. The lie had tumbled from her lips like water from a broken dam, and she had watched Theodore's expression shift from anger to calculation. He had smiled then, a cold smile that made her stomach turn to ice, and he had said nothing to contradict her story. The next 2 weeks had been a nightmare dressed in lace and silk. Theodore's father, Samuel Marsh, had embraced the engagement with enthusiasm, seeing it as an opportunity to appear magnanimous by marrying his son to the poor orphaned daughter of a miner. The whole town had rallied around the romance, and Wilhelmina had found herself swept along in preparations she could not control. She had tried to back out, tried to confess the truth, but every time she opened her mouth, Theodore would appear at her elbow with that same cold smile and a grip on her arm that left bruises. On the wedding day itself, standing at the altar in a borrowed dress that smelled of mothballs and another woman's dreams, Wilhelmina had finally found her courage. When the preacher asked if anyone had reason why they should not be wed, she had spoken up herself. She had confessed everything, her voice shaking but clear, telling the packed church that she had lied, that there had never been an engagement, that she had fabricated the entire courtship out of fear and desperation. The silence that followed had been deafening. Then Theodore had laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the wooden walls and called her a lunatic. His father had demanded she be arrested for slander, for defamation, for fraud. The sheriff had dragged her from the church still wearing the wedding dress, and the judge had sentenced her that same afternoon. $200 or 2 months in shackles in the jail yard, exposed to public ridicule and the elements. It might as well have been $2,000 for all the money Wilhelmina possessed. Now, as the sun beat down on her uncovered head and her knees ached against the hard, packed earth, she wondered if she would survive even 1 week of this sentence, let alone 2 months. Her throat was parched despite the tin cup of water the sheriff's wife had brought her at noon, and her skin felt like it was blistering beneath the thin fabric of the ruined dress. The sound of hoofbeats made her raise her head slightly. Through the haze of heat and exhaustion, she saw a rider approaching the jail yard. He was tall in the saddle, wearing the dusty trail clothes of a cowboy who had been riding hard for days. His hat was pulled low over his face, and a bandana around his neck was gray with dust. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who spent more time on horseback than on foot, and tied his horse to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office. Ezekiel Lawson had been riding for 3 days straight, barely stopping to sleep, driven by a telegram that had reached him at the cattle station in Montana, where he had been working. His younger sister, Margaret, lived in Challies with her husband, and her telegram had been brief but urgent. Woman being tortured in jail yard, stop innocent, stop please come stop Margaret. His sister was not prone to exaggeration or dramatics, so when Ezekiel had received her message, he had collected his wages, saddled his best horse, and headed south without hesitation. Now, standing in the main street of Challies, he could see what had prompted Margaret's plea for help. In the fenced yard beside the sheriff's office, a woman knelt in the dirt, her wrists shackled to a post, wearing what had once been a white dress. Even from this distance, he could see that she was suffering, her head bowed and her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Something hot and angry stirred in Ezekiel's chest. He had seen a lot of harsh justice in his 30 years, but this seemed excessive for any crime short of murder. He strode toward the sheriff's office, his boots striking the wooden boardwalk with sharp cracks that made several townspeople turn to look at him. The sheriff was a thick-set man in his 50s, with a badge pinned to his vest, and the comfortable look of someone who had held power for too long, without being challenged. He looked up from his desk as Ezekiel entered, his eyes narrowing at the sight of this stranger with trail dust on his clothes and a hard expression on his sun-weathered face. "Help you?" the sheriff asked, his tone suggesting he would rather not. "That woman in your jail yard," Ezekiel said without preamble. "What is her crime?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "That is Miss Wilhelmina Orton, and she is serving time for fraud, defamation, and public disruption. Made up a pack of lies about being engaged to Theodore Marsh, caused a scene, disrupted a wedding, and slandered the good name of one of our most prominent families." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "And the punishment for that is shackling her in the sun like an animal." "The punishment," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "is $200 or 2 months in the yard. She could not pay, so she serves the time. That is the law, stranger, and I enforce the law." "I will pay her debt," Ezekiel said flatly. The sheriff sat up straighter, surprise flickering across his face. "You do not even know her." "I do not need to know her to see that what you are doing is cruel," Ezekiel replied. $200, you said. I have it." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. He had been saving his wages for months, planning to buy a piece of land and start his own ranch. Those plans could wait. He counted out the money on the sheriff's desk, each coin clinking against the wood with a finality that made the lawman's eyes widen. "This is irregular," the sheriff protested weakly, but his hand was already reaching for the money. "It is legal," Ezekiel countered. "The law says $200 or 2 months. I am paying the $200. Her debt is cleared and she walks free. Unless you are saying the law means something different than what it states." The sheriff scowled but could find no argument. He swept the coins into his drawer and stood up, fishing a key ring from his belt. "Fine. But she leaves town today. I will not have her stirring up more trouble." "Agreed," Ezekiel said, though his tone suggested he did not think Wilhelmina was the one stirring up trouble. They walked out into the blinding sunlight of the jail yard. Up close, Wilhelmina looked even worse than she had from a distance. Her face was flushed with heat, her lips cracked and bleeding, and her wrists were raw where the shackles had rubbed against her skin. When the sheriff's shadow fell over her, she flinched, and Ezekiel felt that hot anger flare brighter in his chest. The sheriff unlocked the shackles with more roughness than necessary, letting them fall into the dirt with a clang. Wilhelmina swayed, her hands coming up slowly as if she could not quite believe she was free. She tried to stand, but her legs would not support her, and she began to collapse forward. Ezekiel moved without thinking. He stepped past the sheriff and caught Wilhelmina before she could hit the ground, one arm around her back and the other beneath her knees. She weighed almost nothing, and up close he could see the toll the last hours had taken on her. Her eyes were glazed with heat exhaustion, and when she looked up at him, there was confusion and fear in their depths. "It is all right," he said quietly, his voice gentle in a way that would have surprised the men he worked cattle with. "I paid your debt. You are free." "I do not understand," she whispered, her voice a rasp that spoke of thirst and suffering. "You do not need to understand right now," Ezekiel told her. "Right now you just need to rest." He carried her toward his horse, ignoring the stares of the townspeople who had gathered to watch. The sheriff called after him, "Remember, she leaves today." Ezekiel did not bother responding. He settled Wilhelmina carefully onto his horse, then swung up behind her, keeping one arm around her waist to hold her steady. She slumped against his chest, her body trembling with exhaustion, and he could feel the heat radiating off her sun-burned skin. His sister's house was on the edge of town, a neat little cabin with a vegetable garden and chickens scratching in the yard. Margaret must have been watching for him because she came rushing out before he had even fully stopped his horse. She was a pretty woman of 26 with kind eyes and their mother's auburn hair, and right now those eyes were filled with relief and concern. "Ezekiel, thank God," she said, reaching up to help with Wilhelmina. "Bring her inside quickly. Daniel," she called to her husband, who appeared in the doorway. "Heat water for a bath and fetch Dr. Morrison." Daniel Calloway was a solid man who worked at the mill, and he nodded immediately, disappearing back into the house to follow his wife's instructions. Margaret guided Ezekiel into their spare bedroom, a small room with a comfortable bed covered in a hand-stitched quilt. He laid Wilhelmina down gently, and Margaret immediately began examining her, her expression growing grimmer by the moment. 6 hours they kept her out there, Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. 6 hours in this heat with barely any water. I tried to bring her more, but the sheriff said I was interfering with justice. This whole town has gone mad over the Marsh family. "Tell me what happened," Ezekiel said, straightening up and watching as his sister began carefully removing Wilhelmina's ruined shoes. Margaret told him the story as she had heard it, and as she spoke, Ezekiel's respect for the unconscious woman on the bed grew. It took courage to confess a lie in front of an entire church, especially when that lie involved one of the town's most powerful families. It took even more courage to accept the brutal consequences rather than go through with a marriage based on deception. The Marsh family wanted to make an example of her, Margaret said bitterly, to show what happens when someone challenges them. "Theodore Marsh is a brute, Ezekiel. Everyone knows it, but no one says anything because his father owns half the businesses in town. I think Wilhelmina spoke the truth about why she lied in the first place, and I think Theodore was punishing her for rejecting him." Dr. Morrison arrived then, a lean older man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a black medical bag. He examined Wilhelmina thoroughly while Ezekiel waited outside with his brother-in-law. Daniel offered him coffee and a plate of food, which Ezekiel accepted gratefully, realizing he had not eaten since the previous day. "Margaret has been beside herself since they sentenced that poor girl," Daniel said quietly. "She wanted to help, but we do not have that kind of money, and the Marshes made it clear that anyone who interfered would face consequences. I am glad you came, Ezekiel. Your sister thinks the world of you." "She is a good woman with a good heart," Ezekiel said. "She gets that from our mother." "What will you do now?" Daniel asked. "The sheriff meant what he said about Wilhelmina leaving town. If she is still here tomorrow, he will arrest her again on some trumped-up charge." Ezekiel had been thinking about exactly that question. I will take her with me. I was planning to head down to Colorado to look at some ranch land for sale near Durango. She can come along until she figures out what she wants to do. Daniel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It was an unusual arrangement, a single man traveling with a single woman who was not his wife or sister, but these were unusual circumstances. Dr. Morrison emerged from the bedroom, wiping his hands on a cloth. "She will recover," he said. "She is severely dehydrated and has significant sunburn and some blistering on her wrists from the shackles. I have left salve for the burns and instructions for Margaret. She needs rest, fluids, and nourishing food. She should not travel for at least 3 days. She needs to be out of town by tomorrow," Ezekiel said. The doctor's expression hardened. "Then this town's justice system is even more barbaric than I thought. I will say that if she must travel, do so in the early morning or evening when it is cooler. Keep her out of direct sunlight. Make sure she drinks plenty of water and stop frequently to rest. Push her too hard right now and you will kill her." "I will take care of her," Ezekiel promised. The doctor nodded, accepting payment from Margaret and Daniel despite their protests, and left with a final reminder about the salve. Margaret came out of the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. "She is sleeping," Margaret said. "I got some water into her and applied the salve. She will need more water when she wakes up." She looked at her brother, her expression troubled. "Ezekiel, what you did today was wonderfully kind, but what happens now? You cannot just take a woman you do not know out on the trail with you." "I know that," Ezekiel said, "but what choice do we have? If she stays here, they will make her life miserable or worse. At least if she comes with me, she has a chance to start over somewhere new." "People will talk," Margaret warned. "They will assume things about you and her." "People always talk," Ezekiel replied with a shrug. "I stopped caring about that a long time ago. What matters is doing what is right, and right now, getting her away from this town and the Marsh family is what is right." Margaret studied her brother for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You always were the stubborn one in the family." "All right, she can stay here tonight and rest. Tomorrow evening, once the worst of the heat has passed, you can start your journey. I will pack supplies for you both." Wilhelmina woke as the sun was setting, painting the sky outside the bedroom window in shades of orange and pink. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or how she had gotten there. Then memory came flooding back in waves that made her stomach clench with remembered fear and humiliation. The jail yard, the shackles, the sun beating down on her. And then a stranger's face, weathered and strong, and a gentle voice telling her she was free. She sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her wrists and the tight feeling of her sunburned skin. She was wearing a nightgown that was not hers, and someone had bathed her and treated her wounds. The room was simple but clean, and through the door she could hear the murmur of voices. The door opened, and a woman entered carrying a tray. She had kind eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she smiled when she saw Wilhelmina was awake. "You are awake, thank goodness," the woman said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "I am Margaret Calloway. You are in my home. How are you feeling?" "Like I was trampled by a horse," Wilhelmina admitted, her voice still rough. "But better than I was. You helped me." "My brother helped you," Margaret corrected. "He paid your debt to the sheriff. I just provided a place for you to rest and recover." She poured water from a pitcher into a glass and handed it to Wilhelmina. "Drink slowly," the doctor said. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Wilhelmina took the glass with shaking hands and sipped carefully. The water was cool and sweet, and she had to force herself not to gulp it down. "Your brother," she said. "Why would he do that for a stranger?" "Because he is a good man who cannot stand to see injustice," Margaret said simply. "And because I asked him to come. I hope you do not mind, but I sent him a telegram when I saw what they were doing to you. The whole thing was cruel and wrong, and I knew if anyone could help, it would be Ezekiel." "Ezekiel," Wilhelmina repeated, tasting the name. "I need to thank him. And I need to find a way to pay him back." "You can thank him in the morning," Margaret said firmly. "Right now you need to eat something and rest more. The sheriff wants you out of town by tomorrow, and Ezekiel has agreed to take you with him. He is heading to Colorado to look at ranch land. You can travel with him until you decide what you want to do next." Wilhelmina's eyes widened. "Travel with him? But I cannot. I do not know him, and he does not know me. It would not be proper, and I have no right to impose on him further after what he has already done." "What is not proper is what this town did to you," Margaret said, her voice taking on a hard edge. "What is not proper is punishing a woman for telling the truth after being cornered by a man with a bad reputation. You have two choices, Wilhelmina. You can stay here and face whatever else the Marsh family decides to do to you. Or you can accept help from someone who is offering it freely and go somewhere you have a chance at a fresh start. Which will it be? Put that way, there was really only one answer." Wilhelmina closed her eyes briefly, feeling tears prick at her eyelids. She had been so alone for so long, and now strangers were helping her with a kindness she had never expected. "I will go with him," she said quietly, "and I will find a way to repay you both, I swear it." "Just get well and build a good life for yourself," Margaret said, her voice softening. "That will be repayment enough. Now eat your soup before it gets cold." The soup was rich with vegetables and chicken, and Wilhelmina ate every drop despite her still uncertain stomach. Margaret stayed with her, chatting about neutral topics, clearly trying to keep Wilhelmina's mind off the ordeal she had been through. When the bowl was empty, Wilhelmina felt exhaustion pulling at her again, and Margaret helped her settle back into the bed. "Sleep," Margaret said gently. "Tomorrow is a new day, and the start of your new life." Wilhelmina drifted off with those words echoing in her mind, hardly daring to believe them but desperately wanting to. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Wilhelmina woke late in the morning, her body still recovering from the previous day's trauma. Margaret brought her breakfast and a dress to wear, something practical in sturdy brown cotton that belonged to Margaret herself. "It will be a bit short on you since you are taller than me," Margaret said, "but it will do for traveling. I am also packing you another dress and some basic necessities. Ezekiel has agreed to buy you proper traveling clothes when you reach the next town with a good mercantile." "He does not need to do that," Wilhelmina protested, but even as she said it, she knew she had no choice. She owned nothing but the ruined wedding dress, and she could not travel across the territory in that. "He wants to," Margaret assured her. "My brother is not a rich man, but he is careful with his money and he has savings. More importantly, he believes in helping people who need it. Our parents raised us that way." Mid-afternoon, Ezekiel came to the house to check on the preparations. This was the first time Wilhelmina was seeing him in full daylight while fully conscious, and she was struck by his appearance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that brushed his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was tanned from years of outdoor work, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and wind. He looked to be about 30, and there was a quiet competence about him that made Wilhelmina feel instinctively safe. "Miss Orton," he said, touching his hat brim in greeting. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thanks to you and your sister," Wilhelmina said. She stood up straighter, trying to look stronger than she felt. "Mr. Lawson, I do not know how to thank you for what you have done. You saved my life yesterday, and I am deeply in your debt." "You do not owe me anything," Ezekiel said firmly. What was happening to you was wrong, and I had the means to stop it. Any decent person would have done the same. But they did not, Wilhelmina pointed out. You did. That makes you either a very decent person or a very foolish one, and I am grateful either way. A slight smile tugged at the corner of Ezekiel's mouth. Maybe a bit of both. We will leave at sunset when the temperature drops. The moon is nearly full, so we will have enough light to ride by. I want to put some miles between us and Challies before we make camp for the night. Are you well enough to ride? I will manage, Wilhelmina said, though in truth she was not sure. She had ridden horses before, but never for extended periods, and certainly not while recovering from heat exhaustion and sunburn. Ezekiel's expression suggested he heard the uncertainty in her voice. We will take it slow and stop if you need to rest. I am not going to push you too hard. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the journey. Daniel had secured a second horse for Wilhelmina, a gentle mare named Daisy, who had a reputation for being steady and calm. Margaret packed food supplies that would keep on the trail, including hardtack, jerky, dried fruit, coffee, and a small bag of precious sugar. She also included blankets, a spare canteen, and a box of matches sealed in wax. As sunset approached and the sky began to shift through its evening colors, Wilhelmina found herself saying goodbye to Margaret and Daniel, two people she barely knew but who had shown her more kindness than most of her own town ever had. Thank you, she said to Margaret, her voice thick with emotion, for everything. For caring enough to send for your brother, for taking me in, for treating me like a person instead of a criminal. Margaret hugged her tightly. You are a brave woman, Wilhelmina Orton. You stood up and told the truth even when it cost you everything. Do not ever forget that, and do not let what happened here make you lose faith in people. There are good ones out there, and my brother is one of them. I am beginning to see that, Wilhelmina said, glancing at where Ezekiel was securing their supplies to the horses. Daniel shook her hand formally. Safe travels, Miss Orton. I hope you find what you are looking for in Colorado or wherever you end up. Thank you, Mr. Calloway. Take care of your wife. She is a treasure. I know she is, Daniel said with a warm smile at Margaret. Then it was time to mount up. Ezekiel helped Wilhelmina into Daisy's saddle, his hands steady and respectful. She settled herself as comfortably as she could, acutely aware of how her muscles were already protesting. This was going to be a long night. They rode out of Challies as the last light was fading from the sky, heading south on the main trail. Wilhelmina looked back once at the town that had been her home for the past year, the place where her father had died and where she had nearly died as well. She felt no sadness at leaving, only a strange sense of lightness, as if she was leaving behind a weight she had been carrying without realizing it. Ezekiel kept them to an easy pace, clearly mindful of Wilhelmina's condition. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves, the creak of leather, and the evening songs of crickets and night birds. The moon rose, huge and silver, casting enough light that the trail ahead was clearly visible. Finally, Ezekiel spoke. There is a good camping spot about another hour ahead near a creek with shade trees. We will stop there for the night. How are you holding up? I am managing, Wilhelmina said, which was mostly true. Her back ached, and her thighs were already sore from the unaccustomed riding position, but she was determined not to complain. This man had spent his savings to free her, and was now taking her hundreds of miles out of his way. The least she could do was endure some discomfort without whining about it. You can tell me if you need to stop, Ezekiel said, as if reading her thoughts. This is not a test of endurance, and I am not going to think less of you if you need rest. Why are you being so kind to me? Wilhelmina asked suddenly. You do not know me. For all you know, I really did commit fraud and slander. For all you know, I am exactly what the sheriff said I was." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My mother used to say that you can tell a lot about a person by looking at their enemies. The sheriff is a bully who uses his badge to intimidate people who cannot fight back. The Marsh family uses their money and influence to control everyone around them. If those are your enemies, then I figure you must be doing something right. And Margaret is a good judge of character. If she thought you were guilty, she would not have asked me to come." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Wilhelmina said softly. "She was. She died 5 years ago. Fever took her in the winter. My father followed her 6 months later. I think he just did not want to live without her. They were like that, completely devoted to each other from the day they met until the day they died." There was something in Ezekiel's voice, a wistfulness that spoke of his longing for that kind of connection. Wilhelmina understood it because she felt it too, that yearning for a love that was real and true and lasting. They reached the camping spot just as Wilhelmina was beginning to think she could not stay in the saddle another minute. It was exactly as Ezekiel had described, a small clearing beside a clear running creek with cottonwood trees providing cover overhead. He helped her dismount, steadying her when her legs trembled with fatigue. "Sit," he instructed, pointing to a fallen log. "I will take care of the horses and get a fire started." Wilhelmina was too tired to argue. She sank down onto the log and watched as Ezekiel moved through the tasks of making camp, with the efficiency of long practice. He unsaddled the horses and rubbed them down, then let them drink from the creek and tied them where they could reach grass. He built a small fire, and soon had coffee brewing and beans heating in a small pot. The smell of food made Wilhelmina realize how hungry she was. When Ezekiel handed her a tin plate with beans and a piece of hardtack, she ate eagerly, not caring that it was simple trail food. It tasted wonderful after everything she had been through. "We will reach the next town in about 3 days," Ezekiel said as they ate. "It is called Salmon, and it is bigger than Challies. We can resupply there and get you some proper traveling clothes. After that, we will head south through the Sawtooth Mountains and into Nevada, then east into Colorado. The whole journey will take about 3 weeks, maybe a bit more depending on weather and trail conditions." 3 weeks, Wilhelmina repeated, trying to imagine spending that much time traveling with this man she barely knew. It seemed both terrifying and oddly thrilling. "And what happens when we reach Colorado?" "I look at the ranch land I have been corresponding about," Ezekiel said. "If it is as good as the seller says, I make an offer and start building my ranch. If it is not, I keep looking until I find the right place." "And me?" Wilhelmina asked quietly. "What do I do?" Ezekiel looked at her across the fire, his expression serious. "That is entirely up to you. You can come with me to Colorado and see if you can find work there. Or if we pass through a town where you think you might like to settle, you can stay there. I am not going to abandon you somewhere unsafe, but I am also not going to tell you what to do with your life. You have had enough of people trying to control you." The thoughtfulness of his answer made Wilhelmina's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," she managed, "for everything, for your kindness and your understanding, and for treating me like I have a choice in my own future." "Everyone deserves that," Ezekiel said simply. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and Ezekiel showed Wilhelmina how to roll out her bedding near the fire. He laid his own bedroll on the opposite side of the fire, a respectful distance away that Wilhelmina appreciated. She settled into her blankets, every muscle in her body aching, and looked up at the vast expanse of stars overhead. "Ezekiel," she said into the darkness. "Yes." I just wanted you to know that I did tell the truth at that wedding. I did lie about the engagement, but only because Theodore Marsh cornered me and I was frightened. He had a reputation for forcing himself on women who worked in his father's businesses, and I thought if I claimed we were engaged, he would back off in front of witnesses. You do not have to explain yourself to me, Ezekiel said quietly. I know, but I want to. I want you to know who you are traveling with, and I want there to be honesty between us. I made a mistake when I lied, and I paid for it. But I swear to you, I will not lie to you. You have earned my honesty and my respect. There was a long pause, and then Ezekiel's voice came through the darkness, warm and sincere. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, and for what it is worth, I believe you. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow will be another long day of riding. Wilhelmina closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the night. For the first time in weeks, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, her life was not over after all. Maybe it was just beginning. The days that followed fell into a steady rhythm. They rode during the cooler parts of the day, early morning and late afternoon into evening, and rested during the heat of midday. Ezekiel was a patient teacher, showing Wilhelmina how to improve her riding posture to reduce soreness, how to read the landscape for water and shelter, how to build a fire that gave warmth without creating too much smoke to attract unwanted attention. Wilhelmina proved to be a quick learner and a resilient traveler. Despite her ordeal in Challies and the lingering effects of sun poisoning and dehydration, she never complained about the hard riding or the rough sleeping conditions. She did her share of the camp work without being asked, learning to make decent coffee and to clean the tin plates with sand and water from whatever creek or stream they happened to camp near. As they traveled, they talked. At first the conversations were cautious and superficial, focused on practical matters like the trail ahead or the weather. But gradually, as trust built between them, the conversations deepened. Ezekiel told her about his life as a cowboy, moving from ranch to ranch, never quite finding a place that felt like home. He talked about his dream of owning his own land, of building something permanent that would last beyond his own lifetime. Wilhelmina shared her own story, about growing up the daughter of a miner who moved from claim to claim chasing rumors of silver and gold. Her mother had died when she was 12, and after that it had been just her and her father, living in mining camps and rough towns, always on the edge of poverty but held together by their love for each other. When her father died in the cave-in, she had lost not just her parent but her entire world. I thought marrying would be my only option, she admitted one evening as they sat by their campfire. A woman alone has so few choices, especially a woman with no money and no family. I worked at the boarding house in Challies washing dishes and making beds, but the pay was barely enough to keep me fed, and I knew I could not sustain that life indefinitely. When Theodore started paying attention to me, I was flattered at first. He was handsome and wealthy, and I thought maybe he genuinely cared for me. Then I realized he looked at me the same way he looked at the horses in his father's stable, like I was something to be owned and used. You deserved better than that, Ezekiel said, his voice carrying an edge of anger that was not directed at her. I know that now, Wilhelmina said. But at the time I just felt trapped. That day in the mercantile, when he cornered me, I could see in his eyes what he intended. There were other people in the store, but they were all looking away, pretending not to notice. That is when I realized that no one was going to protect me. I had to protect myself. And you did, Ezekiel said. You made a choice that you thought would keep you safe. The fact that it went wrong is not your fault. He is the one who should have been punished, not you. Wilhelmina looked at him across the fire, seeing the sincerity in his expression, and felt something shift inside her chest. This man, this stranger who had become less of a stranger with every passing day, believed her. More than that, he respected her. It was a feeling she was not accustomed to, and it made her heart feel both lighter and fuller at the same time. They reached Salmon on their 4th day of travel. It was indeed larger than Challis, with a proper main street lined with shops and businesses, 2 hotels, and a church with a bell tower. Ezekiel took them to the mercantile and told Wilhelmina to pick out what she needed for traveling. She chose practically, selecting sturdy skirts and blouses in dark colors that would not show dirt, a warm coat for the mountain passes ahead, and her first pair of proper riding boots. Ezekiel paid without complaint, though Wilhelmina saw him wince slightly at the total. "I will pay you back," she promised as they carried their purchases back to the horses. "Every penny, I swear it." "I am not worried about it," Ezekiel said. "Money comes and goes. What matters is that you have what you need." They stayed that night at one of the hotels, Ezekiel insisting that Wilhelmina needed at least one night in a real bed after the rough travel. He paid for 2 separate rooms, a propriety that Wilhelmina appreciated even as she found herself wishing, just slightly, that propriety did not require quite so much distance between them. The next morning they set out again, heading into more rugged terrain as they approached the Sawtooth Mountains. The landscape was breathtaking, all jagged peaks and deep valleys covered in pine forests. The air grew cooler and thinner, and Wilhelmina found herself grateful for the coat Ezekiel had insisted she buy. One afternoon, about a week into their journey, they stopped to water the horses at a small lake surrounded by towering pines. While the horses drank, Wilhelmina walked to the edge of the water and stood looking out at the reflection of the mountains on the glassy surface. Ezekiel came to stand beside her, his presence solid and warm. "Beautiful, is it not?" he said. "It is," Wilhelmina agreed. "I have never seen anything like this. The mining camps were always in ugly places, all torn up earth and muddy water. This is like being in a painting." "This is what I want," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying a note of longing. "Not necessarily mountains like these, but land that is beautiful and unspoiled. A place where I can build a house and raise cattle and maybe plant some trees. A place where I can put down roots and not have to move on when the season changes or the work dries up." "It sounds wonderful," Wilhelmina said softly. Then, feeling brave, she added, "I hope you find it." Ezekiel turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I am starting to think I might have found something even better," he said quietly. Before Wilhelmina could respond, before she could even fully process what he meant, a voice called out from the trees behind them. "Well now, what have we here? A couple of travelers all alone in the wilderness." They both spun around to find 3 men emerging from the tree line. They were rough-looking, with the hard eyes and predatory movements of men who lived on the wrong side of the law. The speaker was a tall man with a scarred face and a gun belt slung low on his hips. His companions were equally disreputable, one with a long knife visible at his belt and the other carrying a rifle. Ezekiel immediately stepped in front of Wilhelmina, his hand moving to the revolver holstered at his side. "We do not want any trouble," he said calmly. "We are just passing through." "I am sure you are," the scarred man said with a nasty smile. "And you will be passing through a lot lighter than you arrived. We will be taking your horses, your supplies, and any money you are carrying. You can keep your lives if you cooperate." "I think not," Ezekiel said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel now. "You are welcome to ride on and leave us in peace. Otherwise, this is going to end badly for someone, and I assure you it will not be us." The scarred man laughed. Big talk for a man outnumbered 3-1. Tell you what, you hand over what we want and we will even let you keep the woman. We do not need that kind of complication. Wilhelmina felt anger flash through her at being discussed like a possession, but she kept quiet, trusting that Ezekiel knew what he was doing. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the readiness in his stance. He had been a cowboy for years, working in rough places with rough men. She suspected he knew how to handle himself in a fight. "Last chance," Ezekiel said. "Ride on." The scarred man's smile faded. "You are making a mistake, friend." He reached for his gun, and everything happened very fast. Ezekiel drew and fired in one smooth motion, his bullet hitting the scarred man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man with the knife lunged forward, but Ezekiel sidestepped and brought his gun down hard on the man's head, dropping him to the ground. The third man, the one with the rifle, was bringing it up to aim when Wilhelmina acted without thinking. She grabbed a rock from the shoreline and threw it as hard as she could, hitting him in the face. He stumbled backward with a cry of pain, and Ezekiel was on him in 2 strides, wrenching the rifle away and using the butt of his own gun to knock the man unconscious. The whole confrontation had taken less than 30 seconds. The scarred man was on the ground clutching his bleeding shoulder, the man with the knife was out cold, and the third man was groaning and holding his face where Wilhelmina's rock had connected. Ezekiel quickly gathered their weapons, tossing them far out into the lake where they could not be easily retrieved. "We need to leave now," he said to Wilhelmina, his voice urgent. "Where there are 3, there might be more nearby." They mounted up quickly, Ezekiel helping Wilhelmina into her saddle even as his eyes scanned the tree line for more threats. They rode hard for the next hour, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the would-be robbers. When they finally slowed to let the horses breathe, Ezekiel turned to Wilhelmina with concern written all over his face. "Are you all right? You are not hurt." "I am fine," Wilhelmina said, though her hands were shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "That was terrifying, but you handled it beautifully. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "Growing up on the frontier, you learn to protect yourself," Ezekiel said. "I have been in my share of scrapes over the years, though I try to avoid them when I can." "That was quick thinking with the rock, by the way. You might have saved both our lives." "I just reacted," Wilhelmina said. "I saw him aiming at you and I could not just stand there. I had to do something." Ezekiel's expression softened into something warm and appreciative. "You are braver than you give yourself credit for, Wilhelmina Orton, and I am very glad you are on my side." Something about the way he said it, and the way he was looking at her, made Wilhelmina's heart skip a beat. Over the past week, she had come to realize that what she felt for Ezekiel Lawson was more than just gratitude for his rescue of her. She admired his quiet strength, his unwavering decency, his dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed and comfortable. She liked the way he listened when she talked, really listened as if her words mattered. She liked the way he moved, economical and graceful, and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She realized with a start, falling in love with him. The realization should have frightened her, especially after her experience with Theodore Marsh. But this felt different. Ezekiel had never tried to control her or pressure her. He had given her space and respect, had treated her as an equal even when she was at her most vulnerable. If this was love, it was a gentle, steady kind, nothing like the panicked desperation that had driven her to lie in Challies. They made camp that night in a defensible position with good sightlines, both of them still on edge from the afternoon's encounter. Ezekiel kept his gun close, and Wilhelmina found herself jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. "We will be all right," Ezekiel said as they prepared for sleep. Those men were not going to follow us, not in their condition, and we will be more cautious from now on. Ezekiel, Wilhelmina said, needing to say something that had been building in her chest all evening. Thank you for protecting me today. You could have just given them what they wanted, but you stood your ground and you kept me safe. I will never forget that. I would never let anyone hurt you, Ezekiel said, his voice carrying a fierce intensity that made her heart race. Not if I have breath in my body to prevent it. You are under my protection, Wilhelmina, and I take that responsibility seriously. It feels like more than just responsibility, Wilhelmina said softly, daringly. Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his strong features. You are right, he said finally. It is more than responsibility. I care about you, Wilhelmina. More than I probably should given how short a time we have known each other. But I cannot help how I feel, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. Wilhelmina's breath caught in her throat. I care about you too, she admitted. I was not looking for this, did not expect it, but it is there all the same. You make me feel safe and valued and seen in a way I have never experienced before. Is that strange to feel so much so quickly? I do not think it is strange at all, Ezekiel said. Sometimes you just know when something is right. My parents said they knew within a week of meeting that they would marry each other. They spent the next 40 years proving that initial instinct correct. You think, Wilhelmina began, then hesitated. You think we might have that too? Something that could last. Ezekiel rose from his side of the fire and came to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. He took her hand gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender as they intertwined with hers. I think we might have exactly that, he said, looking into her eyes. If you are willing to take a chance on a cowboy with big dreams and not much to his name beyond a good horse and a stubborn streak. I think that Cowboy sounds like the best man I have ever met, Wilhelmina said, her voice thick with emotion. And I would be honored to take that chance, if he is willing to take a chance on a woman with a scandalous past and a reputation for telling inconvenient truths. I think that woman sounds like the bravest person I know, Ezekiel replied. And her past does not scare me. What matters is the future we could build together. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when his lips met hers it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Wilhelmina felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were good tears. Tears of relief and joy and the overwhelming gratitude of finding something precious when she had thought herself beyond such blessings. When they finally drew apart, both of them were smiling. Ezekiel brushed a strand of hair back from Wilhelmina's face, his touch reverent. We should probably get some sleep, he said, though he made no move to go back to his bedroll. Probably, Wilhelmina agreed, not wanting him to leave. They compromised by sitting together by the fire for another hour, holding hands and talking in quiet voices about their hopes and dreams, and the life they might build together. When they finally did settle down to sleep, they arranged their bedrolls closer together, near enough that Wilhelmina could hear Ezekiel's steady breathing and take comfort in his presence. The next 2 weeks of travel took on a different quality. They were no longer just a rescuer and the rescued, or even just friends traveling together. They were two people courting in the most unusual of circumstances, learning about each other through long days in the saddle and quiet evenings by the campfire. Ezekiel proved to be a man of hidden depths. He could quote poetry he had memorized from his mother's books, could identify bird calls and animal tracks with ease, could tell stories about his travels that were by turns hilarious and harrowing. He had strong opinions about everything from politics to pie, and he listened with genuine interest, when Wilhelmina shared her own thoughts and experiences. Wilhelmina discovered that she had more to offer than she had believed. Her years following her father from mining camp to mining camp had given her a practical education that complemented Ezekiel's ranching knowledge. She knew how to stretch supplies, how to make damaged equipment function until it could be properly repaired, how to read the sky for weather changes. She had a quick mind for numbers, and had often helped her father with the complicated calculations involved in his mining claims. They crossed from Idaho into Nevada, following old emigrant trails through harsh but spectacular desert landscape. The days were hot, but the nights were cold, and they learned to huddle together for warmth when the temperature dropped, a necessity that neither of them complained about. They talked about the future with increasing concreteness. Ezekiel described the ranch he wanted to build, and Wilhelmina offered suggestions about the house and the outbuildings. They discussed what kind of cattle would do best in Colorado, whether they should try raising horses as well, how they might make the ranch profitable enough to sustain them through hard years. It was during these conversations that Ezekiel first raised the subject that had been on both their minds, but that neither had dared to speak aloud. "Wilhelmina," he said one evening as they sat watching the sun set over the Nevada desert in streaks of orange and purple. "I know we have not known each other long. By the standards of most courtships, we are moving at a reckless pace. But I also know that what I feel for you is real and true and permanent. I love you. I love your courage and your honesty and the way you face challenges without complaint. I love your quick mind and your kind heart. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you look at me like I am someone worth believing in." Wilhelmina's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Ezekiel," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I am asking you to marry me, Wilhelmina. Not right away, not until you are ready and comfortable with the idea, but I want you to know my intentions are honorable and permanent. I want to build that ranch with you as my wife and my partner. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night for the rest of my life. I want to have children with you, if we are blessed with them, and grow old watching them build their own lives. I want all of it, Wilhelmina, the whole beautiful, difficult, wonderful adventure of a life shared with someone you love, and I want it with you." Wilhelmina found that she was crying, tears streaming down her face in the dying light. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Ezekiel, I will marry you. I love you too, so much that it terrifies me sometimes. You gave me back my life, but more than that, you gave me back myself. You made me believe that I was worthy of respect and love and a future. I want to build that life with you. I want all of it, every part of the adventure, the good and the bad and everything in between." Ezekiel pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a deep kiss full of love and commitment and joy. When they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "I do not have a ring to give you," Ezekiel said regretfully. "I spent most of my savings paying your debt and buying supplies for the journey, but when we reach Colorado and I can work again, the first thing I do will be to buy you a proper ring." "I do not need a ring to know this is real," Wilhelmina said, placing her hand over his heart. "This is real, right here. Everything else is just decoration." They decided to marry as soon as they reached Colorado, finding a preacher in whatever town they landed in first. Wilhelmina had had enough of elaborate wedding preparations and public ceremonies. What she wanted was simple and real. A binding of her life to Ezekiel's in the eyes of God and the law, with no lies and no pretense, just two people choosing each other freely and with full hearts. They crossed into Colorado 3 days later, the landscape shifting from desert to high plains to the foothills of the Rockies. The ranch land Ezekiel had been corresponding about was near Durango, in the southwestern part of the territory, and they made their way there with growing excitement. The land, when they finally saw it, was everything the seller had promised and more. It was a valley nestled between rolling hills, with a clear stream running through it and plenty of grass for grazing. There were stands of timber for building, and the soil looked rich enough for a kitchen garden and maybe even some crops. The view stretched for miles in every direction, all the way to the distant peaks of the San Juan Mountains. "This is it," Ezekiel said, his voice full of wonder. "This is the place I have been looking for." "It is perfect," Wilhelmina agreed, already imagining where the house would sit, where they would build the barn and corrals, where they might plant fruit trees that would grow tall and provide shade for their children. They met with the seller that same day, a widower who was moving back east to live with his daughter. He was asking a fair price, and Ezekiel had just enough money left to meet it if he could arrange to pay in installments. They negotiated terms, shook hands on the deal, and by sunset Ezekiel Lawson was a landowner for the first time in his life. "I know it is not much yet," he said to Wilhelmina as they stood on their new property watching the sun go down. "Just raw land with no buildings and no stock. It will take years of hard work to turn this into a real working ranch." "I am not afraid of hard work," Wilhelmina said, threading her fingers through his. "And I am not expecting anything to be easy. What I am expecting is to build something together with you. That is all I need." They rode into Durango the next day to take care of the legal paperwork for the land purchase and to find a preacher. Durango was a bustling town with a railroad line and all the amenities of civilization, including 3 churches. They chose the smallest one, a white clapboard building with a friendly minister named Reverend Thomas, who agreed to marry them that very afternoon. Wilhelmina wore the best of the traveling dresses Ezekiel had bought her in salmon, and she picked wildflowers on the way to the church to serve as her bouquet. There were no guests, except the Reverend's wife and the clerk from the land office who agreed to serve as witnesses. But it was perfect in its simplicity, the exact opposite of the elaborate farce that had almost been her wedding to Theodore Marsh. When Reverend Thomas asked if she took Ezekiel to be her lawfully wedded husband, Wilhelmina said, "I do," with a full heart and no reservations. When Ezekiel slipped a simple gold band on her finger, a ring the Reverend's wife had kindly loaned them until Ezekiel could purchase one of their own, she felt like the wealthiest woman in the world. And when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife and told Ezekiel he could kiss his bride, that kiss felt like the sealing of a promise that would last a lifetime. They spent their wedding night at a hotel in Durango, in a room with clean sheets and a soft bed and a window that looked out over the mountains. Ezekiel was tender and patient, mindful that this was Wilhelmina's first time sharing such intimacy. He made her feel cherished and beautiful and wholly loved, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms as husband and wife, Wilhelmina thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. The next morning, they bought supplies for setting up their initial camp on the ranch. They would live in a tent until they could build a proper cabin, cooking over an open fire and washing in the stream. It would be rough living, but neither of them minded. They were young and strong and deeply in love, ready to face whatever challenges came their way. Over the next months, they worked from dawn until dusk, building their future one log and one fence post at a time. Ezekiel proved to be a skilled carpenter, and with Wilhelmina's help, they constructed a snug one-room cabin with a good stone fireplace and a sleeping loft. They built a barn and corrals, and Ezekiel used the last of their money to buy a small herd of cattle from a neighboring rancher who was willing to extend credit. Wilhelmina planted a garden and learned to make do with the limited supplies they could afford. She sewed curtains from flour sacks and braided rag rugs for the floor. She learned to cook on the open hearth, and if her early attempts were sometimes more charred than not, Ezekiel ate them without complaint and praised her efforts until she improved. The work was back-breaking and the isolation was sometimes difficult, but they had each other, and that made all the difference. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit together on the porch of their little cabin and watch the sun set over their land. Ezekiel would tell Wilhelmina about his plans for expanding the herd, and she would share her ideas for improving the house and gardens. They talked about everything and nothing, the easy conversation of two people who were perfectly comfortable in each other's company. Winter came, and with it, snow that blanketed their valley in white silence. They spent long, cozy evenings by the fire, reading aloud from the few books they owned or simply sitting together working on their respective projects. Ezekiel carved beautiful furniture for their home, while Wilhelmina sewed a quilt from scraps of fabric, each square representing a memory from their journey together. It was during that winter that Wilhelmina discovered she was pregnant. She told Ezekiel on Christmas Eve, giving him the news as a gift more precious than anything that could be wrapped in paper. He had been overcome with joy, holding her carefully as if she might break, his hand resting gently on her still flat belly where their child grew. "You have given me everything," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A home, a purpose, and now a family. I do not know what I did to deserve such blessings, but I promise you I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of them." "You already are worthy," Wilhelmina said, kissing him softly. "You are the best man I know, Ezekiel Lawson, and our child is lucky to have you as a father." Their daughter was born in late summer of the following year, arriving in the early morning just as the sun was rising over the eastern hills. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin, and they named her Margaret Rose, after Ezekiel's beloved sister and Wilhelmina's mother. Margaret Calloway made the long journey from Idaho to meet her namesake, bringing her husband Daniel and staying for a month to help Wilhelmina with the baby. It was a joyful reunion, and Margaret was delighted to see how happy her brother was, how well the ranch was doing, and how obviously in love Ezekiel and Wilhelmina remained. "I knew the moment I saw you two together that it would work out," Margaret told Wilhelmina one afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching Ezekiel and Daniel repair a fence. "There was something in the way he looked at you, even when you were barely conscious and covered in dirt. He saw past all of that to who you really were, and he decided right then that you were worth fighting for. He saved my life," Wilhelmina said simply, "and then he gave me a reason to live it. I will never stop being grateful for that. It is not just gratitude, though, is it?" Margaret said with a knowing smile, "Anyone can see how much you love each other. You two are like my parents were, partners in the truest sense. I am so happy for you both." The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts that tested their water resources and harsh winters that took a toll on their cattle. There were times when money was tight and they had to scrimp and save just to make it through to the next season. But through it all, Ezekiel and Wilhelmina faced each challenge together, their love and partnership only growing stronger with time. They added onto their cabin, building additional rooms as their family grew. A son, Samuel, was born 2 years after Margaret, followed by another daughter, Ruth, 3 years after that. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily, their herd growing and their reputation for quality cattle spreading throughout the region. Wilhelmina proved to have a head for business, keeping meticulous records of expenses and income and negotiating shrewdly with buyers who tried to take advantage of them. Ezekiel relied on her judgment in all major decisions, and their neighbors soon learned that Mrs. Lawson was just as formidable as her husband when it came to protecting their interests. As the children grew, the cabin grew with them. Eventually, it was less of a cabin and more of a proper ranch house, with multiple bedrooms, a real dining room, and a parlor where Wilhelmina kept the piano Ezekiel bought her on their 10th anniversary. The barn was expanded, more corrals were built, and they added horses to their operation, breeding quality stock that became sought after throughout Colorado. Sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when the children were in bed and they had the house to themselves, Ezekiel and Wilhelmina would sit together and marvel at how far they had come from that dusty jail yard in Challies. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if I had not come along?" Ezekiel asked one such evening, his arm around Wilhelmina's shoulders as they sat on their porch watching the stars. "I try not to," Wilhelmina admitted. "I like to think I would have survived somehow, but honestly, I do not know if I would have. Those 2 months in the jail yard might have killed me, or if not, the Marsh family would have found some other way to make my life unbearable. I owe you everything, Ezekiel." "You owe me nothing," Ezekiel said firmly. "We saved each other, Wilhelmina. I was drifting before I met you, moving from place to place with no real purpose or direction. You gave me something to build for, someone to build with. You made me want to put down roots and create something permanent. We are partners in this life, equal in every way." "Equal partners," Wilhelmina agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And best friends, and lovers, and parents. We are so many things to each other, and I love every one of them." Years turned into decades. Their children grew up strong and capable, each of them inheriting their parents' work ethic and values. Margaret married a schoolteacher and moved to Denver, where she became active in the women's suffrage movement, making her mother proud with her fierce advocacy for women's rights. Samuel stayed on the ranch, learning everything his father could teach him about ranching and eventually taking over much of the day-to-day operations. Ruth became a doctor, one of the first women to graduate from medical school in Colorado, and opened a practice in Durango, where she treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay. Ezekiel and Wilhelmina aged together gracefully, their hair turning gray and their faces lining with the marks of years spent outdoors in all weather. But their love for each other never dimmed. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming the kind of profound connection that needs no words, where a glance across a room could communicate volumes, and the simple act of holding hands carried the weight of 50 years of shared history. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The old cabin that had started as just one room was now a sprawling ranch house with additions and improvements made over the decades. The land that had been empty except for grass and stream was now dotted with outbuildings and fences, home to hundreds of cattle and dozens of horses. Samuel stood up at dinner to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day, who showed us that hard work and honesty and partnership can build something lasting, who proved that the best adventures are the ones you undertake together. May you have many more years of happiness together." "Hear, hear," chorused the gathered family, and Ezekiel and Wilhelmina looked at each other with tears in their eyes and joy in their hearts. That evening, after all the guests had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Ezekiel and Wilhelmina walked out to their favorite spot, a hill overlooking the valley with a view of the mountains in the distance. It was the same spot where Ezekiel had first said, "This is it," all those years ago, and it had become their place to come when they wanted to reflect on their life together. "Can you believe it has been 50 years?" Wilhelmina said, her hand in Ezekiel's as they looked out over the ranch they had built. "It seems like just yesterday I was kneeling in that jail yard thinking my life was over, and then you appeared like something out of a dream and gave me a second chance." "It was not a dream," Ezekiel said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "It was the smartest thing I ever did, paying that debt. $200 bought me the love of my life, a family I adore, and a purpose that has sustained me through everything. That was the best investment I ever made." "You never asked for anything in return," Wilhelmina said, turning to face him. "You just gave freely and without expectation. That is who you are, Ezekiel Lawson, a man of honor and generosity and love. I have been blessed every single day of these 50 years to be your wife." "And I have been blessed to be your husband," Ezekiel replied, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "You have been my partner, my confidant, my greatest supporter, and my deepest love. If I had the choice to live my life over again, I would not change a single thing, because every choice led me to you." They kissed then, a gentle kiss full of the sweetness of long love and the promise of whatever years remained to them. When they drew apart, both of them were smiling through their tears. The moon was rising over the mountains, painting the valley in silver light. Down below, they could see the lights of their house where their children and grandchildren slept, safe and warm and loved. Somewhere in the barn, cattle lowed softly, and the stream continued its eternal song as it flowed through their land. "You remember what you said to me that first night we camped together?" Wilhelmina asked. "You told me about your parents, about how they were completely devoted to each other from the day they met until the day they died." "I remember," Ezekiel said. "I think we have that," Wilhelmina said softly. "That kind of love, the kind that lasts." "I know we do," Ezekiel agreed. "We built it together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, and we will keep building it for as long as we both shall live." They stood there together on their hill, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and had chosen to build a life that was richer and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined alone. The Wild West that had once seemed so harsh and unforgiving had become home, and the love that had started in a dusty jail yard had blossomed into a legacy that would endure through generations. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, their path lit by moonlight and by the love that had sustained them through 5 decades, Wilhelmina thought about the girl she had been in that jail yard, broken and hopeless and certain that her life was over. If she could speak to that girl now, she would tell her to hold on, that salvation was coming in the form of a cowboy with gray eyes and a good heart. She would tell her that the worst day of her life would lead to the best life she could imagine. But she did not need to tell that girl anything, because she had lived it all. Every moment of hardship and triumph, every challenge overcome, every joy shared. She had lived the great adventure of loving and being loved by Ezekiel Lawson. And that was worth more than all the gold in all the mines her father had ever chased. Their story, which had begun with lies and ended in truth, with imprisonment and ended in freedom, with despair and ended in joy, was a testament to the power of courage, kindness, and love. It was a story worth living, and they had lived it well. Together, always together, they walked into the house they had built with their own hands, closed the door on the night, and prepared for whatever tomorrows remained to them. And those tomorrows, however many there were would be filled with the same love and partnership that had defined all the yesterdays that came before. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the hardships they had faced or the obstacles they had overcome, but the love they had chosen and nurtured and protected through all the years. That love was their legacy, their triumph, and their happily ever after. And it was more than enough.